Hello everybody, this is Debolina Byabortta, Faculty, Department of English, Uluberia College, affiliated to the University of Calcutta. I am here to lecture to you today on Daniel Defoe's novel Robinson Crusoe, that is there in the 4th semester syllabus of English Honours, and this piece is included in CC8 under CBCS system. Today's lecture is going to be in 3 parts. The first part would look at the biographical and historical context behind the production of Robinson Crusoe. The second part of the lecture would look at the literary and critical context. And the third part would be dealt with the plot of the novel itself. To begin with, Daniel Defoe was born in the year 1660 in London. His father, James Foe, was a hard-working and fairly prosperous fellow, chandler, and later a butcher of Flemish descent. By his middle 30s, Daniel was calling himself Defoe, probably reviving a variant of what may have been the original family name. As a nonconformist or a dissenter, Foe could not send his son to the University of Oxford or to Cambridge. He sent him instead to the Academy of Newington Green, kept by the Reverend Charles Martin. Martin, who later became the first vice president of Harvard College, is seen as a major influence on Defoe's writing style. The other influence was that of the Bible. Although he intended for the Presbyterian ministry, Defoe decided against this, and by 1683 he had set up as a merchant. He called trade as his, I quote, beloved subject, and it was one of the, abiding interests of his life. Soon after setting up in business in 1684, Defoe married Mary Tuffley, the daughter of a well-to-do dissenting master. Although he intended for the Presbyterian ministry, he had by 1683 set himself up as a merchant dealing in many different communities. In spite of his own considerable savings and his wife's dowry, Defoe went bankrupt in 1692. Although he paid his creditors, he was never entirely free from debt again. Defoe evidently knew King William III. Indeed, his bankruptcy in 1692 for the enormous sum of $17,000 was primarily because of the losses suffered from underwriting marine insurance for the king. Although he settled with his creditors in 1693, he was plagued by the threat of bankruptcy throughout his life and faced imprisonment for debt and libel 7 times. Arrested in 1703 for having published The Shortest Way with the Dissenters in 1702, Defoe was tried and sentenced to stand in the pillory for 3 days in July. He languished in Newgate prison, however, until Robert Walpole released him in November and offered him a post as a government agent. Defoe continued to serve the government as a journalist, as a pamphleteer, and as a secret agent for the remainder of his life. The most long-lived of his 27 periodicals, A Review, was especially influential in promoting the union between England and Scotland in 1706 to 1707, and in supporting the controversial Peace of Utrecht in the year 1713. Defoe published hundreds of political and social tracts between 1704 and 1719. Defoe's interests and activities reflect the major social, political, economic, and literary trends of his age. He supported the policies of William III and Mary after the Glorious Revolution of 1688 that continued to 1689, and analyzed England's emergence as the major sea and mercantile power in the Western world. He pleaded for leniency for debtors and bankrupts and defended the rights of Protestant dissenters. Effectively utilizing newspapers and journals to make his points, he also experimented with the novel form, which was still in its infancy. However, Defoe died in a comatose lethargy in Ropemaker's Alley on April 24th in the year 1731, while hiding from a creditor who had commenced proceedings against him. Besides Robinson Crusoe, which is the text that we are going to discuss today, the names of among the works of or rather important works of Daniel Defoe, mention may be made of Memoirs of a Cavalier, which was published in 1720, Captain Singleton in the same year, and The Fortunes and Misfortunes of Moll Flanders in 1722. Among his other important writings, there are A Journal of the Plague Year of 1722, Colonel Jack of the same year, or Roxana of 1724, The Tour Through the Whole Island of Great Britain, etc. So, after this particular portion, we move on towards the second part of my lecture. The second part of my lecture will concentrate on the literary and critical context, and here our text that we are going to discuss is Robinson Crusoe, and Defoe's Robinson Crusoe is considered to be the first novel in English. Now the point is, it is not by chance that English novel dates back to the 18th century. This does not imply that nothing existed in the form of a novel before 1700s. Then Daniel Defoe made the genre of the novel came into existence completely. Nothing rather comes from nothing. Even the greatest masterpieces of literature starts off from what was available from the previous eras, right? The novelist in the 18th century had on the one hand the medieval romances and its successors, the courtly novel of Italy and France, and English stories. The 16th and 17th centuries were developed and grown out of some important sources like Lilly's Euphues, Sidney's Arcadia, and Green's Menaphon, etc. On the other hand, the rogue novels and picaresque tradition were two other important factors to the rise of the English novel. Certain other factors were helpful to the rise of the English novel as well. From them, translations from the classics such as the Golden Ass of Petronius or that of Boccaccio, as well as the authorized version of the Bible, can also be mentioned. It is possible to say that the novel as a literary genre emerged in the beginning of the 18th century. The Industrial Revolution can be said that paved the way to the rise of the middle class, and it also created a demand for people's desire for reading subjects related to their everyday experiences. The novel, therefore, developed as a piece of prose fiction that presented characters in the real life events and situations. Defoe's Robinson Crusoe and Henry Fielding's Tom Jones are some of the early English novels. The novel is a realistic prose fiction in such a way that it can demonstrate its relation to real life, which we know in the name of the narrative process called verisimilitude that the author incorporates in his particular text. In the 18th century novels, the 18th century novels in particular are semi-anti-romance, or it was for the first time that the novel emerged and distributed widely and largely among readers or the reading public. Moreover, with the increase of literacy, the demand on the reading material increased rapidly among well-to-do women who were novel readers of the time. Further, the invention of the travelling library was developed more than before. Women readers were considered as a crucial factor in providing readership. The greater leisure for women left a time and space which needed to be filled in. Both men and women were receptive to the literary forms which would open to them recent and real worlds outside their own world. The next thing that is to be taken into consideration is the reproduction of the newspapers in the 18th century, which is the evidence or which paved the way for the rise of the novel, and so it is the plurality, and so is the plurality of the periodicals as well. The seed of Richardson's Pamela, for example, was a plan to write a series of letters which provided examples of the correct way of continuing in various delicate social situations. The middle class people considered moral usefulness to be the significant. The readers were introduced by the novelists to new social worlds, providing the moral framework within that behavior. This is precisely in this context Daniel Defoe's structure of Robinson Crusoe emerged. The story of the book relied on a real life event. It is about the story of Alexander Selkirk, a Scottish sailor who quarrelled with his captain, who was in fact put into the island of Juan Fernandez near Chile, and he lived there for say 4 years all alone. In Robinson Crusoe, Defoe deals with major points of Western civilization like trade, mercantile capitalism, since at that time a great attempt was made to dominate other continents or to spread culture, beliefs and the like. For example, we can talk about Robinson's very attempt to convert Friday into Christianity, as he considers him a savage. The 18th century Britain economically was dependent on the slave trade, which was abolished in the early 1800s. Therefore, Daniel Defoe was familiar with this practice, even though he did not actively criticize it. There is, eventually no surprise that Robinson rather treats Friday as his slave. However, Crusoe was able to recognize Friday's humanity, though he does not see his slavery as a contradiction. Robinson Crusoe was written with a context of European colonialism, which was well established around the globe at that particular point of time. Another thing is, material wealth was and is a symbol of prestige and power in Robinson's mind as we read it. For instance, he often lists his belonging like the amount of land being plowed. Robinson is a semi-Puritan figure and he tries to spread his convictions on the island to convert into Christianity. He simply refuses Friday's own beliefs, thinking that his religion is the best one. This may be due to the fact that the British people believed that they had a right and a duty to transmit their knowledge, their culture in their own surroundings. However, Robinson Crusoe has been conjectured or interpreted as an allegory of Defoe's own life, but critics like Ian Watt endorses the economic theorist's view of the novel as illustrating Homo economicus and the rise of the economic individualism. Keeping all this in mind, let us move on to the third part of this lecture, that is the plot overview of the novel, namely Robinson Crusoe. Robinson Crusoe is an Englishman from the town of York in the 17th century, the youngest son of a merchant of German origin. Encouraged by his father to study law, Crusoe expresses his wish to go to sea instead. His family is against Crusoe going to the sea, and his father explains that it is better to seek a modest and secure life for oneself. Initially, Robinson is committed to obeying his father, but eventually succumbs to temptation and embarks on a ship bound for London with a friend. When a storm causes the near deaths of Crusoe and his friend, the friend is dissuaded from sea travel, but Crusoe still goes on to set himself up as merchant on a ship leaving London. This trip is financially successful and Crusoe plans another one, leaving his early profits in the care of a friendly widow. The second voyage does not prove as fortunate. The ship is seized by Moorish pirates and Crusoe is enslaved by a potentate in North African town of Sallee. While on a fishing expedition, he and a slave boy break free and sail on the African coast. A kind Portuguese captain picks them up, buys the slave boy from Crusoe and takes Crusoe to Brazil. In Brazil, Crusoe establishes himself as a plantation owner and soon becomes successful. Eager for slave labor and its economic advantages, he embarks on a slave gathering expedition to West Africa but ends up shipwrecked off the coast of Trinidad. At this particular point of time, Crusoe soon learns that he is the sole survivor of the expedition and seeks shelter and food for himself. So, Crusoe is absolutely left here all alone, and he returns to the wreck's remains 12 times to salvage guns, powder, food and other items. On shore, he finds goats he can graze for meat and builds himself a shelter. He erects a cross that he inscribes with the date of his arrival, that is 1st September 1659, and makes a notch every day in order never to lose track of time. He also keeps a journal of his household activities, nothing his attempts to make candles. He takes note of everything, and his very attempts to make candles, his lucky discovery of sprouting grain and his construction of a cellar among other events. In June 1660, he falls ill and hallucinates that an angel visits, warning him to repent. Drinking tobacco-steeped rum, Crusoe experiences a religious illumination and realizes that God has delivered him from his earlier sins. However, after recovering, Crusoe makes a survey of the area. He finds a pleasant valley abounding in grapes where he builds a shady retreat. Crusoe begins to feel more optimistic about being on the island, describing himself as its king. He trains a pet parrot, takes a goat as a pet, and develops skills in basket weaving, braid making, and pottery. He cuts down an enormous cedar tree and builds a huge canoe from its trunk. Then he discovers that he cannot move it to the sea. After building a smaller boat, he rows around the island but nearly perishes when swept away by a powerful current. Reaching shore, he hears his parrot calling his name and is thankful for being saved once again. He spends several years in peace there. One day, Crusoe is shocked to discover that a man's footprint on the beach. He first assumes the footprint is the devil's, then decides it must belong to one of the cannibals said to live in the region. Terrified, he arms himself and remains on the lookout for the cannibals. He also builds an underground cellar in which to herd his goats at night and devises a way to cook underground. One evening, he hears gunshots, and the next day he is able to see a ship wrecked on his coast. It is empty when he arrives on the scene to investigate Crusoe once again. He thanks to Providence for having been saved. Soon afterwards, Crusoe discovers that the shore has been strewn with human carnage, apparently the remains of the cannibal feast. He is alarmed and continues to be vigilant. Later, Crusoe catches sight of 30 cannibals heading for shore with their victims. One of the victims is killed. Another one, waiting to be slaughtered, suddenly breaks free and runs towards Crusoe's dwelling. Crusoe protects him, killing one of the pursuers and injuring the other, whom victim finally kills. Well armed, Crusoe defeats most of the cannibals on shore. The victim vows total submission to Crusoe in gratitude for his liberation. Crusoe names him Friday to commemorate the day on which his life was saved and takes him as his servant. Finding Friday cheerful and intelligent, Crusoe teaches him some English words and some elementary Christian concepts. Friday in turn explains that the cannibals are divided into distinct nations and that they only eat their enemies. Friday also informs Crusoe that the cannibals saved the men from shipwreck Crusoe witnessed earlier, and that those men, Spaniards, are living nearby. Friday expresses a longing to return to his people, and Crusoe remains upset at the prospect of losing Friday. However, Crusoe then entertains the idea of making contact with the Spaniards, and Friday admits that he would rather die than lose Crusoe. The two build a boat to visit the cannibals' land together. Before they have a chance to leave, they are surprised by the arrival of 21 cannibals in the canoes. The cannibals are holding 3 victims, one of whom is in European dress. Friday and Crusoe kill most of the cannibals and realize the European are Spaniard. Friday is overjoyed to discover that another, the rescued victims, as his father. The 4 men return to Crusoe's dwelling for food and rest. Crusoe prepares to welcome them into his community permanently. He sends Friday's father and the Spaniard out in a canoe to explore the nearby land. 8 days later, the sight of an approaching English ship alarms Friday. Crusoe is suspicious. Friday and Crusoe watch as 11 men take 3 captives on shore in a boat. 9 of the men explore the land, leaving 2 to guard the captives. Friday and Crusoe overpower these men and realize the captives, one of whom is the captain of the ship, which has been taken in mutiny. Shouting to the remaining mutinees from different points, Friday and Crusoe confuse and tire the men by making them run from place to place. Eventually, they confront the mutineers, telling them that all may escape with their lives except the ringleader. The men surrender. Crusoe and the captain pretend that the island is an imperial territory and that the governor has in reality spared their lives in order to send them all to England to face justice. Keeping 5 men as hostages, Crusoe sends the other men out to seize the ship. When the ship is brought in, Crusoe nearly faints. On December 19, in the year 1686, Crusoe boards the ship to return to England. There, he finds his family is deceased except for two sisters. His widow friend has kept Crusoe's money safe, and after traveling to Lisbon, Crusoe learns from the Portuguese captain that his plantations in Brazil have been highly profitable. He arranges to sell in Brazilian lands. Wary of sea travel, Crusoe attempts to return to England by land but is threatened by bad weather and wild animals in northern Spain. Finally, arriving back in England, Crusoe receives word that the sale of his plantations has been completed and that he has made a considerable fortune. After donating a portion to the widow and his sisters, Crusoe is restless and considers returning to Brazil. But he is dissuaded by the thought that he would have to become a Catholic. He marries and his wife dies. Crusoe finally departs for the East Indies as a trader in the year 1694. He revisits his island, finding that the Spaniards are governing it well and that it has become a prosperous colony. So that is all for today. But at the end, I would like to highlight that no lecture could substitute the pleasure and necessity of actual reading of the text. So, mine is also, you may say, a kind of aid or a kind of help to your better understanding. I also encourage my students to go through the other notable works of Defoe.